As a journalist, you've covered everything from American politics and voting rights to environmental justice. Tell us about Cape Town's Day Zero and what inspired you to write about it.
So I'll take the second part of the question first. I grew up in the American South in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And being there at that time, I was always kind of intimately familiar with the ways in which our destiny with race and class inequality was bound up with South Africa and apartheid. And I've worked in Cape Town and Pretoria and Joburg before doing public health projects, and I've seen up close just how tightly intertwined those destinies and policy conversations are. So when I heard last year that there was a drought in Cape Town, where I'd worked before, and lots of newspapers like the New York Times here in America were saying, this could be the very first time a major city ran out of water in this way. And so I began to think, what does it mean for a city to run out of water, quote unquote? What does it mean in Cape Town, a place that we know is deeply marked by inequality and still is marked by racial inequality? And as I began to sort of do research into what the causes were, who the major players were, who was going to be affected by it, I realized that there was a big story here on Day Zero. Day Zero was the day that the local government and the media forecast that they might run out of water. And I realized that both in the sort of run-up to Day Zero and how people responded to it and reacted to it, and how the local government enacted policy, and also in the greater effects of climate change, of what people do when they're faced with a more hostile and changing weather and world. All those things, they resonate across the Atlantic. And what I got to working on was a piece examining the ways in which they resonate and how they affect not only Cape Townians, but other South Africans, other people in Southern Africa, and other people who are marginalized across the world.
So, Van, the local government issued a water conservation agenda. What were some of the initial water restrictions that were imposed on the people of Cape Town, and how did those restrictions increase dramatically?
So looking back on it, Cape Town's actually been remarkably successful, probably the most successful city in world history at reducing water usage in a very short amount of time. And the way they did it was through actually something in the order of 12 to 14 different regulations and steps of increasingly restrictive water provisions that they had. So they started out mostly on a voluntary basis, saying people we would like you to not water your plants, to recycle your shower water if you can. They began to make cuts with big businesses and people who used really high amounts of water. And over time, those restrictions became more and more involuntary and tighter and tighter. So you had, toward the end of the cycle, you had people who basically they had to recycle all their shower water. They were not able to flush their toilets in the morning. And you saw all over Cape Town signs at public bathrooms saying, do not flush, and how they enforced these mechanisms. They had one thing in houses that restricted the flow of water to houses, but also there were social pressures. So local officials encouraged residents to inform on one another if they used too much water. And there weren't a whole lot of fines or sort of more punitive measures, but there was intense social pressures. They had visits from local officials to people who used too much water. And you see from household to household, universally there were decreases in water usage, but those decreases came with further downstream costs socially and economically.
So when the restrictions were first put in place, you said people were on board to pitch in to help limit the water consumption. But as the restrictions grew, how did that change, if at all?
Well, of course, everybody, the messaging around Day Zero was very strong, and it did mobilize lots and lots of people to get out and think about the way they use water, how much they use, and how much they waste. And in the early going, I can say it was very effective. It got People across class, across race, in the informal settlements in the center of the city, in businesses and agriculture, to all begin to ratchet down their water usage. It's unambiguous. People immediately began slowing their consumption of water. But as the restrictions grew more, as the messaging became more and more dire, as it became clear that there were inequalities in the access to water in the first place, that's when you saw some of the social breakdown, some of the higher pressure on local elected officials. You saw people protest the very idea of day zero. They did not believe that the government was necessarily telling the truth about when it was, how much they knew about when it might be, and the science behind the predictions. And actually, they may have been vindicated in the end because it did not happen. And then you see the old divisions within the city, within the province and the region, began to become stories again and began to be deepened as these tighter restrictions fell heavily on lower middle class families. You saw people who were living in the inside of the city, who were living in wealthier places, who were whiter and had better access to water, were blaming the fact that Cape Town was growing. And that's always a code word for poorer people coming in for work. You saw people blaming it on the informal settlements that use per capita much less water than people in the city. And then you saw on the reverse, people on the outskirts, people on the margins looking at agriculture and people living in much larger estates who are watering their grass and using much larger amounts of water and saying, wait, you all are the cause of this. You should be using proportionally less water than we are. So I think when it really got down to it, when it got close to the point of actually running out of water, of the reservoirs hitting bone dry status, you saw the same old distinctions between rich, poor, middle class, white and black and colored in the country. They were highlighted again, and they mattered very deeply.
Now, luckily, Cape Town was able to make it through the rainy season without day zero actually happening. Can you tell us a little bit more about what scientists are saying about day zero and whether or not there's a clear indication of whether it could happen in the future?
So at the outset, Cape Town's climate and weather is very unpredictable, and the drought is part of that unpredictability. We don't really have hard science telling us that droughts like this was one of the biggest droughts, the most devastating droughts in the region's history. It lasted for years. There were usually, you have a whole really intense rainy season that's offset by a dry season, and for lots of years, the rainy season just didn't come. But if you look at what climatologists in the area are saying, it's unclear if, even in a warming world where we know the climate is changing, where we know it will be hotter next year and the year after that, if that's more likely in the future. But what we do know is that climate change makes the weather more volatile. It makes more extreme events more likely. So it may not make the droughts of this nature and character more predictably come along in the future, but it will make it so if droughts do come, they probably be longer and more intense. And also we know that things are getting warmer, and as the weather warms, people use more water and they need more water. So we use more water for agriculture when it's hotter. People, they sweat, they drink more water. And this is all in a place like Cape Town where the population is growing, where there's a higher base demand on the local water supply. So it seems like a pretty fair bet to say that climate change will make access to water issues more common and more widespread in the city and the region in the future.
VANN NEWKIRK of The Atlantic, thank you for your reporting, and thanks for joining us on 24 Hours of Reality.